Hi everyone, I've had a request to look at some more advanced art topics, in particular texture mapping and re-topology, so I'm going to demonstrate those concepts. We'll start with how we would apply a texture to a model. So I've got the traffic cone from the last video. I'm going to go to UV editing, and if I go to face mode, you can see that the faces are laid out on the UV panel here on the left. So if I select some of the faces here, it shows where they're mapped on the left view here. And if I select the whole thing, it shows us all the UVs here. So what this means is that if we paint in this area in Photoshop, the pixels will be mapped onto the center of the cone. If I was to paint in this area in Photoshop, that will be drawn on the bottom of the cone. And so let's select the whole thing and export the UV map so we can begin texturing this. So we can go UV, export UV layout. We'll call this the cone UVs. It's going to save a PNG at 1024. Export. Okay, then I would go to Photoshop and open that. Okay, here's the cone UVs image. I'm going to open it up in Photoshop. This is what we get. So perhaps we would like to do a more realistic stripe with some weathering and wear, and we could also paint some shading into this to make it look more realistic. So let me set up my layers. I'm going to copy the background layer and call this the UVs. I like to be able to see the UVs while I'm painting, so I would typically desaturate them. So Control U, desaturate it, and Control L to bring up the level. So I'd like to make this pure black and white, so I'm going to drag the white level down to here. And this is useful because I could see through this. I could make a layer here, we'll call this the orange. And if I was to fill this with an orange color, I can then turn on the UVs and set them to multiply. And now if I paint in this layer, I can see through. I can see what I'm doing. So I can see the UVs and paint at the same time. I find this setup is very useful. Let's do some shading. So if we go back to Blender, we can see which edge is which. If I go to edge mode and select this edge loop, let me synchronize this. Yeah, okay, so I can see that these faces, sorry, it's zooming very quickly. These faces here are, there's a corner, there's a crease here, so it would be nice to put some shade there. So let's go to Photoshop, select this area here, and we could do a gradient to shade this area. So let's get the colors. G for gradient. Let's do a linear gradient this way. Alright, and then I'll select this area here and do another gradient this way. So that could represent a little bit of shading there, some ambient occlusion where the cone is creased. Let's do the white stripe. So I'll make a layer. Select the region. So I remember that it's these polygons here, so it's easy to just select this region. Fill it with white. Now, perhaps pure white would not be very realistic. I think it's pure white in the real world. Let's darken it a little bit, make it a bit more of a gray. And then I'd like to make it a little bit worn and weathered, as if it's old. So I might put a mask on it. Get a rough brush, reduce the opacity a little bit, and then I could do something like this and just wear it out. Make it look old and scratched. Let's get a better brush. So I'm just using some of these natural media brushes just to get a rough effect. And then perhaps there would be a highlight. So this is the edge, the outer edge of the cone. So let's paint a highlight in here. Let's select this area. Let's get a gradient from orange to very slightly brighter orange. And I'll just do a gradient this way. And then I'll select this area and send the gradient that way. So this is artificially lighting it. I'm painting some shade and highlight and details in here. Now, when you're ready to save the texture, you would turn off the UV. So once again, remember to keep your source file, which is your Photoshop file, and your final in-game assets separately. So let's look at where I'm going to save this. I'm going to save this one, and this is in the source folder. So this is going to be the cone source. This is a PSD file. Now, the actual texture that's going to go in Unity, I'll turn off the UVs, and I'll save this one. We'll go back to Assets, Textures, we'll call this Cone. Diffuse. So diffuse is just another way of saying it's the default color, the unlit color. Let's make this a PNG. Save. Now, my cone in Blender has actually got two materials on it. I separated the faces in the middle here because I gave them a white material. Let's set that back to the other material, traffic cone orange. So let's put traffic cone orange assigned. So now the whole thing is traffic cone orange. Let's re-export this into Unity and have a look at the texture. So File, Export FBX, and then we put it in the Assets folder, Models. There's the traffic cone. Okay, I want the selected objects, and I want no animation. Export. Let's go back to Unity. Let's get the right scene. Okay, so now we can see the traffic cone. It's missing the stripe that used to be there because I've set it all to one material. If we go over to the renderer here, you see materials, it's only got one material. But if I go to the traffic cone orange material, we can now change this to use the texture. So the texture goes in here in albedo. I'm going to select cone diffuse, and then to see the texture with the correct lighting, we need to change the color back to white. And now you can see where I painted the wear on the cone. It shows up. You can see the little bit of shading and highlighting that I painted there. So that's the basics of how to get a texture on a model. Step one is unwrap it in Blender, then export the UVs, open the UVs in Photoshop or whatever paint package you like, put them on a layer so that you can paint, save this as a PNG, go back into Unity, connect the PNG to the albedo of the material. Alright, let's look at some advanced concepts. So typically in modern games you will create a high resolution version of your model and a low polygon version. The low polygon one is the one that actually goes in the game in Unity, and the high polygon one is used for creating a normal map, and there's a few different ways to do that. Let's take a look at them. So there's a couple of ways to go about this. Let's talk about first why would you want to do this. Here's the low polygon version of this baseball cap. If I select all the faces, it says there is 324 triangles. Sorry, 620 triangles in this model. I'm looking at this down in the corner, the bottom right. So this would render and play nice and fast in Unity. It's low polygon, so it's very efficient. However, it doesn't have much surface detail. If we look at the surface, you can see it's just completely smooth. Now here's a high polygon version of the hat. You can see all the additional edges, but it's got extra surface detail, which you can see there. Now it would be nice if we could use this surface detail on the low polygon model, and that's what a normal map does. A normal map is a texture which records the high resolution detail and displays it on the low polygon model. And there's a few ways to do this, but probably the easiest way is to start with the low polygon. So you might build a low polygon prop like this. That'll be a typical starting point. Duplicate it, move it over, and then start sculpting on it to make a high polygon one. So if I go to sculpt mode in Blender, I'll turn on dynamic topology so that it creates new polygons, and then I can add polygons like this to make it high resolution. I can use the draw tool to draw bumps into it and extra detail. I can hold down shift to smooth it out and make it softer. and I can crease it, pinch it, and do things like that if I want to make hard edges. So this is one way to work. You might start with a low polygon model, duplicate it, create all this additional detail, and then generate the normal map, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. There's another way to work though. You might start with the high polygon model. So let's look at another file. In this case, I've got a very high polygon gun, and you could do something called re-topology, where you take the high polygon version and then you use it as a sort of a template and you trace a low polygon one. So the aim of the game is to have the high polygon and the low polygon in the same scene, in the same position, and then you can render the normal map. So here's my low polygon gun, here's my high polygon one, and what you do is you line them up on top of each other like this, then you get the material on the low polygon gun, and you select normals, and then you click bake, this button over here, bake, and this copies the detail from the high polygon gun onto the low one as a texture. I'll show you what this looks like in Substance Painter. So here is the original low polygon gun. Let's turn on the wireframe so you can see. Right, it's really low polygon, but I can use the normal map that's rendered out of Blender to make it look like it has more detail. So for example, I can turn on this normal map. Now let's take a look at this area in particular. So the gun is very few polygons, there's no polygons in here, but the texture of the normal map generates the lighting as if it was higher resolution. And so this way we get the benefit, the speed benefit of the low polygon model, but the detail from the high res mesh. Let me take you through the steps on how you actually create a low polygon version from a high polygon. Here's an example of a very high polygon model. This is sculpted using sculpting tools, and it's designed for 3D printing, so it's a very smooth surface, lots of polygons. You can see it's got a ridiculous number of triangles to generate all this detail. So this would not be suitable for a video game. It has 290,000 triangles in it. Typically video game characters are 5 to 10,000. This thing's 290. So obviously we need if we wanted to put this in a game, we would need a much lower polygon model. So let's demonstrate how you do that. Let's add a plane. So I would use this as a starting point. There's my night. Let's call this the low polygon. And there are a whole bunch of tools in Blender to allow you to do this easily. So the first thing I'll do is rotate this around and line it up roughly with the front of the knight. Now let's start on his face actually. Okay, so there's a few settings I'm going to use to get this to work. First is I'm going to turn on snap to face. So if I go face in here, turn on snapping, let me demonstrate what this does. When I go to vertex mode and move a vertex, it projects it back onto the knight. You see how that's snapping onto the face of the knight? So when I click in the middle here and move, these vertices are jumping right onto the object below. Let's change the color of this one so we can see it better. Let's go to display and change the color. And then we'll just set this to object. Okay, so now we can see it a bit better. Now, one thing you might notice is that my polygons are going inside the knight and they're hard to see. So if we turn on this setting here in front, it will always draw in front. Now this looks weird when you look through the knight, but it's very useful when you're working in this point of view. Next thing is that the knight is symmetrical, so it would be nice to just work on one half at a time. So I'll add a symmetry modifier. It's called mirror actually in Blender. We want to mirror on the y-axis. This has a nice feature in it called clipping, which prevents the vertices from crossing the middle. So if I'm working on a vertex here, oops, I'm on the wrong model. if I'm working with this vertex, clipping prevents me from sliding across the middle so that your model stays nice and symmetrical. So you can see that this is a good way to work. You'll be able to build a low polygon version of the knight by tracing it. Now Blender provides this tool called Polybuild, which is really good for working in re-topology. Polybuild is a faster way of sculpting low polygon models. You can just click and drag on a vertex. So unlike the move tool where you have to select first and then move it, when you're in Polybuild mode you can just immediately click and drag, so it saves you selection. The next thing is you'll notice it highlights the edges in blue when you're near an edge. So when an edge is highlighted in blue, you just click and drag and it grows a new edge from that, which is very nice. So I can just do that. It'll grow a new edge, and then when I click like this, they're snapping to the knight's face. If I drag another one here, I can do this. Sometimes you'll want to build a new polygon between some edges. You can move towards a vertex and hold Control, and then when you drag it out, it drags out a new vertex. So just get your mouse in the right position so that the vertex you want is highlighted. Blue dot, hold Control, and you can do that. So this is a fantastic workflow for making a low polygon version of a model. You would trace the whole thing as best you can. Then you would UV map the low polygon version, and then bake the normals of the high polygon one to get the normal map. Let's just finally take a look at texturing in Substance Painter. So after you've made your low polygon version, what I showed you earlier, texturing in Photoshop, that's a good way to learn, but most artists don't do that anymore. They either paint the surface in here in Blender, so Blender has a texture painting panel where you can paint in 3D, but Substance Painter is even better. Substance Painter lets you mask materials in a clever way. Let me demonstrate. So I can simply just drag a steel gun material onto the whole surface, and it automatically does the scratches and highlights and things like that. Substance has all these pre-made materials for metals and human skin and leather, things like that. The back parts of this gun are plastic, so I have a plastic material here and here. And then I've hand painted some extra scratches and things. You can see those here. And you can quickly just change colors if you need a different color, like that. So the way this is actually working is using masks. For example, if I wanted the trigger to use a different material, let's say, let's switch this back to black so you can see it better. If I wanted the trigger to use this material, I would just go to this material here and go to the paint and paint white, and it would then apply that material to this region. So it's a lot like working with masks in Photoshop, but you can just paint directly in 3D. And then if I switch to black, I can turn that material off. So these days most artists actually create their materials in Substance Painter. I actually painted a few extra bumps in here. This layer is creating additional normal map, additional bumps. So that's one of the nice things about Substance Painter, is you can actually paint with height. So to summarize, you can start with a high polygon model and then re-topologize to low polygon using the Polybuild tool, which is this one here. Or you could start with low polygon. Let's go back to the other one. Or you could start with low polygon and then go to Blender's sculpting mode and sculpt extra details on it. When you're ready to actually create the normal map, you simply select the normals material and click Bake, and it generates the normal map. Now, I realize I went pretty quickly through all this. This is really just to give you a preview of what the high resolution art pipeline looks like. I'll link some tutorials and further detail on UV mapping and sculpting and things like that in the Discord. So this is the last video for this session. Remember that the final assignment is due on the 14th. I've postponed it by a week to give you a little bit of extra time. You can email me your projects before then if you want some feedback or you want me to test them in VR. Remember, you've got to submit a PDF, and the PDF will contain a link for me to download your build. You can either zip the Unity project and submit that, or you can build the Unity project to a standalone exe and I'll play it as well. If you're confident that it's going to work in VR, go ahead and build the exe, but if you're not sure, if you want me to test it, then just submit the entire Unity project. The best way to do it is probably on Google Drive. Okay, thanks for watching.